The air inside the Zirin battlecruiser hummed with an otherworldly energy, a deep, thrumming vibration that pulsed beneath the metal floor. Dr. Ethan Carter felt it in his bones, a subtle reminder that he was the only human aboard a ship full of warriors who saw him as little more than a scientific curiosity. It wasn't just the gravity difference, the scent of ionized air, or the way the walls seemed to breathe in response to the Zirin occupants. It was the way she looked at him. Commander Vela, standing just a few feet away, regarded him with sharp, bioluminescent eyes, her expression an exquisite blend of disdain and amusement. Barely 4 feet tall, she was a compact force of precision and power, every muscle honed for combat. Unlike most Zirins, who displayed stoic indifference toward outsiders, she found him particularly entertaining. "Your species is perplexing," she mused, arms crossed over her armored chest. "Weak, underdeveloped, biologically inefficient. And yet you insist on intermingling with superior races." Ethan raised an eyebrow, suppressing a grin. "Is that a diplomatic way of saying you don't think humans belong here?" "I am stating a fact," Vela replied smoothly, shifting her weight onto one leg. "Your kind relies on emotion and adaptation instead of physical supremacy. That makes you unreliable, unpredictable, and wholly unfit for survival." The corners of Ethan's mouth twitched. This wasn't the first time he'd been underestimated, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. "Unpredictability isn't always a weakness," he countered. "It's how humans thrive. We evolve, we adapt. We turn limitations into advantages." Vela snorted, the faint glow of her skin pulsing in rhythm with her mirth. "You sound as though you believe that." She took a step closer, tilting her head. "Tell me, Dr. Carter, what exactly does your species possess that is of any interest to mine?" Ethan leaned in slightly, holding her gaze. "I could tell you," he said, voice dropping just enough to stir the air between them. "But I think it'd be more fun to show you." A flicker of something unreadable passed over her face before she scoffed. "Bold words for a species with such..." Her gaze swept downward in obvious assessment. "Limited assets." Ethan didn't flinch. "Funny," he said smoothly. "Back on Earth, size isn't the only thing that matters." Vela's expression remained unreadable, but something in her stance shifted, just a fraction, but enough for Ethan to notice. She was used to control, to dominance, to dismissing anyone who didn't meet her species' standard of worth. But humans were different. He was different. The tension between them thickened as an audible chime echoed through the chamber. Vela straightened, shifting her attention to the glowing panel embedded in the wall. A transmission flickered to life, displaying Admiral Zathrek, one of the ruling elders of the Zirin fleet. "Commander," the Admiral's voice crackled through the intercom, deep and authoritative. "We have an unregistered challenge on file." Vela stiffened, her bioluminescence flickering in a rhythmic pattern. "From whom?" A brief silence followed. Then, Ethan's name appeared on the screen. Vela whipped around, eyes narrowing at him. "What have you done?" Ethan blinked. "I have no idea." The Admiral's voice returned, more intrigued than displeased. "By Zirin custom, Dr. Carter has issued a compatibility challenge. As per tradition, Commander Vela, you are required to engage or forfeit." The chamber fell silent. Ethan's mind worked rapidly, piecing together the implications. "Hold on," he said, raising his hands. "What exactly did I challenge?" Vela's glare could have burned through reinforced steel. "You unknowingly invoked an intimate compatibility trial, a test of strength, endurance, and suitability." Ethan exhaled. "Oh." He looked at Vela, taking in the rigid set of her jaw, the way her bioluminescence flickered in a pattern he hadn't seen before. There was no backing out of this. The Zirins had their customs, and he just stumbled headfirst into one of the most sacred. "Well," he said, suppressing a smirk, "guess I'd better make this interesting." Vela's eyes darkened with something that wasn't quite anger. "You have no idea what you've just started." A slow grin spread across Ethan's face. "Perfect." The Zirin battlecruiser's training chamber was a cathedral of motion, high ceilings reinforced with gravity-enhancing technology, walls pulsing with the ship's bioluminescent energy, and a floor designed to simulate battlefield terrain. To Ethan Carter, it felt like he'd stepped into a gladiator's coliseum, except instead of roaring crowds, dozens of Zyran warriors observed him with unreadable expressions. At the center of it all stood Commander Vela, her luminous eyes fixed on him like a predator studying prey. "You still have time to withdraw," she said, arms crossed over her armored chest. "No human has attempted a compatibility trial with a Zyran before. There is no shame in recognizing your limitations." Ethan rolled his shoulders, cracking his neck with an easy smirk. "Funny, I was about to say the same to you." A murmur rippled through the assembled warriors. Zyrans weren't accustomed to defiance, especially not from species they considered biologically inferior. Vela's glow pulsed in agitation, or was it amusement? "This isn't a joke," she said, stepping closer. "The trial of strength measures physical endurance, mental resilience, and emotional control. If you fail, I will be forced to reject your challenge, and you will be deemed unfit as a mate." Ethan arched a brow. "And if I win?" She hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face. "Then, we will see." That was good enough for him. A deep, resonant chime echoed through the chamber. The trial had begun. The air thickened instantly, a weight settling over Ethan's shoulders as if invisible chains had wrapped around him. Zyran physiology thrived in extreme gravity, their muscles dense with bio-reinforced fiber. Humans? Not so much. Ethan's knees buckled slightly, but he adjusted, forcing his breath to remain even. Focus on movement, not pressure. His heart pounded, but he kept his posture steady. Vela paced in front of him, unaffected. "Most non-Zyrans collapse within a minute. You're already at 40 seconds. Ethan gritted his teeth. "So, what do I win if I last too?" Vela's lips curled. "A slow and painful demise." One of the observing warriors let out something that sounded suspiciously like a chuckle. The Zyrans, for all their rigid structure, appreciated boldness. Ethan focused on small, controlled movements, rolling his shoulders, shifting his stance. The trick wasn't brute strength, it was adapting under pressure. His body screamed, but he refused to give Vela the satisfaction of seeing him falter. When the chamber finally released the artificial gravity, Ethan exhaled in triumph. Vela was staring at him, her gaze slightly narrowed. "Impressive." Ethan smirked. "You sound surprised." "I am," she admitted. Then, softer, "You shouldn't be." The second trial wasn't about physical endurance, it was about mental resilience. A projection screen flickered to life, displaying a neurofeedback simulation. The Zyrans used this test to expose deep-seated fears, past traumas, and weaknesses. It was meant to break warriors who relied on brute strength alone. "Stand within the ring," Vela instructed, gesturing to the holographic platform. "The system will pull from your subconscious. If you cannot withstand your own mind, you cannot withstand a Zyran bond." Ethan stepped forward without hesitation. Big mistake. Darkness enveloped him. Suddenly, he wasn't on the battlecruiser anymore. He was home. Earth. The lab. The containment breach. A familiar face flickered into view, Dr. Layla Monroe, his former research partner. Blood smeared across her lab coat. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. He knew what this was. Knew it wasn't real. But his chest tightened all the same. "You couldn't save me," her voice finally whispered, distorted, echoing in his skull. "You never could." Ethan's breath hitched. The scene shifted. Fire, smoke, the deafening wail of alarms. Layla reaching for him, eyes wide with terror. Then, cold silence. Ethan clenched his fists, grounding himself. "This isn't real. This isn't real." "Fascinating." Vela's voice cut through the illusion, pulling him back. "Your pain fuels you, but you refuse to let it consume you." Ethan exhaled sharply. "Yeah, well, I don't have time for ghosts." The chamber's lights flickered back to normal. The trial was over. Vela studied him with an intensity he hadn't seen before. "You are unlike any human I've encountered." Ethan smirked. You need to meet more humans. Something flickered across her expression. Interest. She recovered quickly. Final phase. This was the one Ethan knew he couldn't win. Hand-to-hand combat against a Zyran warrior? The odds weren't in his favor. But winning wasn't the point, endurance was. Vela shed her outer armor, revealing the sleek, Bioflex combat suit beneath. She rolled her shoulders, stepping onto the sparring mat. Rules? Ethan asked. She smirked. Survive. Then she attacked. It was like being hit by a moving train. Ethan barely dodged her first strike, but the second sent him sprawling. His ribs screamed in protest, but he forced himself up. Vela circled him. You should stay down. Ethan wiped blood from his lip. Not my style. He adjusted his stance. He wouldn't beat her in brute force, but he could outlast her. He moved differently this time, evading rather than blocking, tiring her out instead of trading blows. Vela wasn't used to an opponent adapting mid-fight. She hesitated, just for a second. Ethan capitalized. Using her own momentum, he redirected her force, throwing her off balance. She hit the ground, eyes wide with genuine surprise. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then laughter. Vela, flat on her back, chuckled, low and throaty. The sound sent an unexpected jolt through Ethan's chest. Well, she exhaled, propping herself on one elbow. You certainly know how to surprise. Ethan extended a hand. I do my best. She hesitated, then took it. Their hands met. Her grip was firm, but the electricity between them was undeniable. The chamber doors slid open. The Admiral's voice echoed through the space. The trial is complete. By Zyran law, Dr. Carter has passed all 3 phases. The room fell silent. Vela's gaze locked onto Ethan's. You realize what this means? She murmured. He grinned. I'm officially your problem now. Vela's lips parted slightly. A flicker of amusement, and something else. Then, softly. So it seems. The tension between them shifted. Neither of them moved. The Zyran battlecruiser drifted through the vast silence of space, its biomechanical hull pulsing with the steady rhythm of life. Inside, tension rippled beneath the surface like an undercurrent before a storm. Ethan Carter stood in the dimly lit meditation chamber, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He had passed the trial of strength, a feat no human had ever accomplished. His name was now embedded in Zyran records, and more importantly, so was his bond to Vela. The realization was a slow burn in his mind. You're awfully quiet. Vela's voice cut through the silence. She leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching him with those glowing, unreadable eyes. Ethan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Just thinking. Regrets? Her voice was steady, but there was something behind it. Something she wasn't used to showing. He turned to face her. No. Just trying to figure out what happens next. She studied him, her bioluminescent markings flickering in a slow, thoughtful pulse. According to Zyran custom, we are now bonded for compatibility evaluation. Ethan smirked. Sounds like a fancy way of saying we're stuck with each other for a while. Her lips twitched slightly. Essentially. A long silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken things. Ethan took a slow step closer. So, what exactly does compatibility evaluation entail? Vela's glow flickered in what he was beginning to recognize as hesitation. She was always so confident, so sharp-edged and direct. This was different. Typically, it involves a series of engagements, she finally said. Ethan arched a brow. Engagements? She cleared her throat, clearly uncomfortable. Physical, intellectual, and emotional trials meant to assess long-term viability. The final outcome determines whether the bond is permanently accepted or dissolved. And what happens if we fail? Her gaze didn't waver. Then we separate. You return to your people. I return to mine. We do not cross paths again. Ethan absorbed that. The thought of walking away, of this being temporary, sat heavy in his chest in a way he hadn't expected. And if we pass? He asked, his voice softer. Vela didn't answer right away. Her bioluminescence dimmed slightly before flaring again. Then the bond becomes permanent. Ethan felt the weight behind those words. This wasn't just a casual fling. Ziran bonds weren't something to be broken lightly. They were rare, deeply ingrained in biological and cultural laws. Permanent. He stepped closer. And how do you feel about that? Vela inhaled sharply but didn't move away. I don't know, she admitted, voice quieter than usual. This isn't how I imagined any of this. Ethan chuckled, tilting his head. Didn't picture yourself stuck with a weak human? She narrowed her eyes. You are not weak. That surprised him. Excuse me? You endured trials no human should have been capable of passing, she said, tone steady. You fought with intelligence rather than brute force. You resisted a psychological assault that has broken Ziran warriors. You do not lack strength, only arrogance. Ethan let out a breathless laugh. High praise coming from you. She tilted her head slightly, watching him. You intrigue me, Ethan Carter. For the first time since they met, she said his name. It sent something sharp and unexpected through his chest. He held her gaze, the space between them thin, charged, dangerous. Likewise, he murmured. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Vela stepped back, as if pulling herself from a gravity well. You require rest, she said briskly, slipping back into the sharp-edged commander he first met. We begin compatibility trials at dawn. Ethan recognized the retreat for what it was. He let her go, watching as she disappeared down the corridor. The Ziran battlecruiser was eerily silent. Outside the viewing window, a nebula swirled like a living storm, its luminous tendrils stretching into infinity. Inside, the tension between Ethan Carter and Commander Vela was just as vast, just as unpredictable. They stood in the ship's sanctum, a private chamber used only for final compatibility rites. The air was thick with something neither of them had the words for, not quite conflict, not quite surrender. Something on the edge of both. Vela stood at the center, arms folded, her glowing eyes locked on Ethan. She had spent years hardened by duty, conditioned to believe that emotions were a liability, a weakness that no warrior could afford. But here she was, on the precipice of something irreversible. You could still walk away, she said, her voice quieter than before. No one would fault you for it. Ethan tilted his head, watching her. Would you? Vela hesitated. Then, almost imperceptibly, she shook her head. A slow smile tugged at his lips. Then I'm staying. A breath passed between them, a shift. For all the trials Ethan had survived, this was the true test. Vela stepped forward, her bioluminescence pulsing in a slow, steady rhythm. Ziran compatibility bonds are not merely ceremonial, she said. They are physiological, neurological. If we proceed, our biofields will align, permanently. Ethan exhaled. No turning back now. So what do I do? He asked. Vela studied him. Let go. Ethan barely had time to process her words before she reached for him. The moment their hands touched, something cracked through him, an electric jolt of sensation that flooded his nerves, setting his skin ablaze. His breath hitched as the room around them blurred, his mind caught in an unfamiliar wave of alien sensation. Suddenly, he wasn't in the sanctum anymore. He was in her memories. A battlefield, drenched in violet light. The acrid scent of scorched metal. Vela, younger, fiercer, grieving. A fallen warrior lay at her feet, his glowing skin dimmed forever. Her mate. Ethan gasped as the emotions crashed into him. Loss. Anger. Guilt. She had been here before. She had loved once, and she had lost everything. No wonder she feared this. Ethan pulled back, blinking rapidly as the vision shattered, leaving them back in the chamber. His heartbeat roared in his ears. Vela was watching him, her expression raw, exposed. You saw, she whispered. He nodded. Yeah. She swallowed hard. And now? Ethan took a breath. His instincts screamed at him to say something light, something safe, but instead, he stepped forward, closing the space between them. No, he said, voice steady. I understand why this scares you. Vela's glowing eyes flickered. You think that if you let someone in again, you'll lose them. Ethan continued. That you'll be alone again. That it's better not to risk it. Her breast shuddered. It is safer. Ethan nodded. Yeah. But safe doesn't mean alive. The silence between them shifted, became something fragile, trembling, waiting. Then she moved. Vela closed the gap between them, her hands gripping his uniform, pulling him in like a warrior claiming victory. Their first kiss was not delicate, not hesitant. It was fierce, searing, a clash of wills and desires. And when they finally broke apart, breathless, pulse racing, altered forever, Vela's lips curled into something almost like a smile. Perhaps, she murmured, humans are not so limited after all. Ethan chuckled. Took you long enough to figure that out. Vela's gaze darkened, her bioluminescence flaring. Shall we test the limits further? Ethan grinned. I thought you'd never ask.